Oh, it's so good to be back. I love this idea. I love these people. I hope you'll be glad as well by noon today that you came today. I don't know. I am going to be trying something different today, I have to say. So you're kind of my guinea pigs. Basically, where I want to go today is to introduce you to a friend of mine and unpack one of her main, most important works. And this is one of the books that you can't really summarize. It's like a really good novel, right? And a friend asks you, well, what's that book about? You're like, just read it. You know, I can't distill the thing. That's kind of how I feel about this book. But we're going to try, which is why I've never done it before, because I just tell people to go read it. And then where I really want to go is kind of zeroing in on some practical encouragement for you and some thoughts about how you can be forming your threefold creativity. That's the big idea today. So I'm going to start by introducing you. Is it the top button that advances? Yeah? The middle? Got it. To my friend Dorothy, who I've never met because she died 68 years ago. But she's incredible. She's insatiably creative. She's brilliant. She's wonderfully opinionated. And, I've never met her, of course, but I've spent a lot of time with Dorothy Sayers. She insisted on that middle initial. Very proud of that part of her family history. Spent a lot of time with her just in a literary sense. How many of you have read something by Dorothy Sayers? Okay, just a handful. Good. Well, this is going to be fun then. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about her because in order to understand the book we're talking about, I think it really helps to understand the life and what is behind the creation of this work. So Dorothy was, from the beginning of her upbringing in Oxford and the fens of Eastern England, late 19th, early 20th centuries, she was absolutely captivated by beauty and by stories and the arts. One of her earliest memories was the ringing of the bells in Oxford every morning. Her father, Reverend Henry Sayers, was headmaster of University Cathedral Choir School in Oxford, but then he was called to be a parish priest here in Bluntisham, England, of St. Mary's Church. There it is, gorgeous church out in the fens. And she was an only child, and so she found all this company with ample books that are scattered throughout the rectory, and she began writing her own poems and her own plays at an early age, in addition to playing violin and singing in the choir, so just multi-artistic, super talented. One of my favorite photos of her is starring in one of her own plays that she wrote, pulling her friends along. Dorothy was educated at home until her parents, who were recognizing her remarkable talent, they sent her to St. Godolphin boarding school that was meant to prepare her for university. She got really sick. She had to go back home to actually finish her schooling, which was actually even more remarkable that she won this prestigious Gilchrist scholarship to Somerville College in Oxford, having essentially done all of her schooling on her own. So she goes off to university, Somerville College. That's Dorothy in the middle and some of her classmates. She's at this women's college, Somerville, and is studying modern languages. She's specializing in French, and she started what's called the Mutual Admiration Society. I think we all need a mutual admiration society. And the idea was, with her friends, you bring a work that you're working on, you share it, and you mutually admire each other's work. And there's critique involved as well. But there she started sharing her poems and other writings. She started publishing. Her first published work is called Opus 1. You can see she had big ideas for her career. It was a small volume of poetry. She finishes her studies in Oxford, and she goes off to do various jobs of teaching and, it's kind of jumping around between teaching and editing jobs and just finding them too demanding. There's too much work to do for her to really focus on her writing, which is her true passion. But she found a good gig. In 1922, she became a copywriter at an advertising agency in London. And one of my favorite little details of Dorothy's life is she came up with all of Guinness's advertising. Like this one, if he can say as you can, Guinness is good for you, how grand to be a toucan, just think what toucan do. That was Dorothy Sayers. And other wonderful ways that Guinness advertised their beverages. But this job, it was 9 to 5. She enjoyed it, wasn't too demanding, and it afforded her the time to really spend on her writing. So it was a year after she landed this job that she came out with her first novel, Whose Body? And this was the beginning of her Lord Peter Wimsey detective stories, which she became super famous for. She'd go on to write 11 more detective novels in the 1920s and 30s, and it earned her place among the queens of crime. So this is Agatha Christie and Marjorie Allingham and Ngaio Marsh. But the success of these novels really propelled her into the public eye. She became a public figure. And upon the suggestion of her friend Charles Williams, may have heard that name, one of the Inklings, she was invited to write a play for the prestigious Canterbury Festival. Now, at this point, she'd only published one play, Busman's Honeymoon, which is a detective comedy kind of play. But she hadn't attempted any kind of theological writing up to this point, just been detective novels and a detective play. But this was a really amazing invitation. Why did I blank on his name? T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot had been one of the invitees. Charles Williams himself had written a play, and now Dorothy's been invited. So she took on the assignment, and she wrote The Zeal of Thy House in 1937. It was an enormous success, and according to one biographer, kind of created a new Dorothy Sayers, a literary Sayers who's now a lay theologian as well. So you get kind of this combination. And from here on, from 1937 on, she devoted more and more of her time to theological plays, essays, editorials, translations, and became really one of the most recognized Christian writers and thinkers in wartime and post-wartime Europe, alongside her good friend Jack Lewis, C.S. Lewis. So soon after staging this, she began writing about Christianity, as she wrote in one of her Times editorials, as the greatest drama ever staged. And she completed more plays, one more for the Canterbury Festival, actually, and then some sacred radio plays during war. So just as C.S. Lewis was doing radio things, which became Mere Christianity, so Dorothy Sayers was doing radio things, but she was doing plays that were performed in that way. One of them, which became enormously successful, was called The Man Born to be King. I'll say more about that in a little bit. So that was 1941. And by now, Sayers is totally solidified as a creative and subversive theological voice, willing to explore new expressions and implications of that greatest drama ever staged. So, and I'm getting to the book we're talking about today. So this is 1939, 1940, right? War is afoot in Europe. Sayers was intensely concerned with social decay, and she conceived of this series of books on social reconstruction. She called it the Bridgeheads series. It was inspired in part by T.S. Eliot's The Idea of a Christian Society, which he had given as lectures at Cambridge. But Sayers wanted to write books, this is a quote from her, to quicken the creative spirit, which enables man to build systems in the light of his spiritual, intellectual, creative, and social needs. So she tested this with a little volume that's not very well known called Begin Here, a wartime essay. But she wrote it in like a week, and she wasn't really happy about it. So she said, I need to write something really substantial. And that's where we get to The Mind of the Maker. This one here, 1941. And the seed of this book, which would turn out to be her most extensive theological treatise as well, was planted at the closing scene of that first theological play that she wrote, The Zeal of Thy House. So at the end of that play, there is this line coming from the archangel in the play, where the angel says, Praise him that he hath made man in his own image, a maker and a craftsman like himself, a little mirror of his triune majesty. For every work of creation is threefold, an earthly trinity to match the heavenly. And that's it. That's the idea. Every work of creation is threefold. That's the primary insight that this entire book is about, the mind of the maker. So we're going to explore that in a moment, but just to kind of round out Dorothy's story, it's good to point out that she never had any kind of formal theological training, which makes this even more remarkable in my mind. As a theologian, I'm like, wow. I mean, I could never even get close to this kind of insight. But she gained awareness of the theological tradition by reading a lot. Her favorite was G.K. Chesterton, also a detective writer, also a brilliant theologian, as well as formative friendships. So her friendship with C.S. Lewis, her friendship with Charles Williams, and active participation in Anglican church life. And you've got other influences like the philosopher Jacques Maritain, who was good friends and a mentor to Georges Rouault, who we mentioned, as well as someone like R.S. Collingwood and his book Principles of Art. She's got another really brilliant essay called Toward a Christian Aesthetic, which is not very well known. There's various versions of her collected essays, and you can find it in there. And that kind of continues some of the trajectories in the mind of the maker. You might want to pick that up at some point. Anyway, Sayers continued writing more plays, nonfiction, translation. She was dedicated to translating Dante's Divine Comedy for the last several decades of her life. But she had a sudden death in 1957. She died at the age of 64. Didn't really have any complications. She just didn't wake up one day. But right before that, she received an honorary doctorate of literature from Durham in 1950. She was in the midst of translating the Divine Comedy. So many contributions, right? Just multi-talented, polymath, creative kind of person. And when C.S. Lewis wrote his panegyric for her, he says, "We can thank the author who invented her." And I feel that every time I read something by her, like, wow, thank God for Dorothy Sayers. So, what we're going to do is I am going to try to distill this book and present to you the main arguments of the book, which will get into some very practical. She talks about scaling trinities. So if all of our creativity, all of our making is threefold, because we're human and we're not God, it's always out of balance in some way. So how can we be aware of that, and how can we seek to shore up and form and strengthen the aspects of our creativity that may be a bit weak? So that's kind of where I want to go. And I will pause in just a little bit, as I'm unpacking her main points, and just see what questions you have. So, you can interrupt me. That's fine as well. If you're like, whoa, what? Say that again, or what are you saying? But I'll pause, and so jot down any questions you might have. Okay, so Sayers opens the mind of the maker with a defense of Christian creeds, which she declares are not just arbitrary constructs of some kind, but statements of facts about the universe. So to say that God is triune, that the triune God is maker of all, and that God's creation, all of God's creation, reflects his triune nature, is not just conjecture. It's not some sort of flimsy opinion, but it's an observation of just how the world works, how we work as human beings, how the universe functions. So she says it's akin to saying that you need to break eggs in order to make an omelet. That's what the creeds are like. It's a fact. It's not like saying the chef who makes the omelet needs to wear a top hat. Maybe not, right? No, it's the nature of how things work. So if God is the maker, and humans are created in God's image, then to be human is to be a maker. So both God and humanity share this characteristic, this desire and ability to make things. This is an analogy, of course, so we don't absolutely know, We only know God by analogy, so we're very humble in stating these things, as Dorothy lays out. But she insists that this analogy between human making and divine making is incredibly generative, and it's underdeveloped in the Christian tradition. And here's where some of her snarkiness comes out. She's like, theologians are way too analytic. We need more artists to tell us how things work. And if we're created in God's image as makers, then shouldn't we be looking to artists to gain insights about who God is and how the world works, right? So that's what she's doing in this book. And that the more we learn about artists and the creative process, the more we learn about God. And the more we learn about God and God's triune nature, the more insight we'll have about our artistry and creative process. So that's what the mind of the maker does, and it guides us through this interdisciplinary, brilliant conversation between theology and the arts. She wants to create this synthesis experience between our theological, spiritual experience of the world and our artistic, creative experience of the world. That is one of the best examples in my mind in the Protestant tradition of theologically informed artistry and artistically informed theology, which is what I'm so passionate about that. And so I love to really commend prime examples of it, which we have here. So what's the crux of her thesis then? All of our creativity is threefold, just like God's. And just to explain for a second, this isn't just kind of artistry proper. This is any creative activity in the world, which is everybody. You know, not everyone is an artist, but everyone is creative. So if you're creating a business, if you are creating a garden, if you're creating a meal, if you're creating a painting, the same process is at work, she would argue. So when Sayers, she's going to reflect on what she knows best, which is writing. I know we have some writers in the room, so this will be helpful. But be thinking about your own creative expressions, your own creative processes with art proper or just with your vocation in the world. And I guarantee this will apply. So it's a threefold dynamic of idea, energy, and power. Like the three sides of a triangle, these are distinct elements of the creative process, but they form a unified whole, just like God. So you have Father aligning with the idea, God the Son aligning with the energy or the activity, which is another word that she likes to use, and the Spirit that's aligned with power. Distinct modes or elements of God's unifying essence or being. So she's explaining this from the writer's experience. Let me first unpack what she means by idea, and then energy, and then power. So the idea, hopefully this is relatively intuitive. It's the idea for the project. This is the, hey, we're the Battlefield Trust, and we would like to have some illustrations. There's an idea. It's the synopsis, right? It's here's what we want to create. And we're kind of holding this whole idea in mind for the whole work. So it's separate from the energy or the activity of writing the book in this case, but it can be only really known and revealed in the process of doing the work. So great, you have an idea, but you're not really going to know all of the ins and outs of that idea until you start the work, until you are invested in the energy. Just like that relationship between the Father and the Son, that the Father is only known through the Son, right? They're distinct elements of God's being, but the Son reveals the energy of the Son, the incarnation of the Son reveals the very Word of God, right? So the idea ensures a unity of purpose and theme throughout a creative work, but it can't just be reduced to the work itself. The idea holds the whole creative project at once that's then revealed through the act of making, or the incarnation of each word in the example of writing. Okay, makes sense so far? The idea. That is then incarnated in the energy. So the energy or the activity, this is the actual making of the work, like when a writer fleshes out the characters and the plot and the scenes and the struggles. And Sayers says that good writers pour all their energy into each character and into each scene. doing so with an attentiveness to the diversity of all those different parts, but with an attentiveness to the idea all the way through, and how all of those different parts of the story fit with the overarching idea. Now, without the investment of energy into the work, it's going to lack power. And it's going to bore those who read it, because you're going to get stock characters, and you're going to get overly predictable plot development, or whatever the case may be. If it's not good craft, it's not going to have strong power. So there needs to be a full investment from the inspiration of the idea into the energy. That idea remains distinct, Sayers says, from the creation, but there's this complete investment. There's this pouring oneself out into the creative activity. And she observes, I love this quote, that nobody but a God can pass unscathed through the searching ordeal of incarnation, of taking an idea and trying to get it on a canvas, or get words on page, or flesh this out. This is difficult, very personally invested kind of work. But this, of course, and she keeps going back and forth between artistry and theology, and artistry and theology. She says this confronts us with the core mystery of Christianity, that God not only incarnated his idea in characters other than himself, but became one of the characters and actually suffered the full brunt of incarnation in his own creative work. The greatest parallel, Sayers says, is like a playwright who acts on the stage of their own play, which is near and dear to my heart, that analogy, because I'm a theater and theology guy, and I love this. She says as well, for writers, as well as for God, the writing of autobiography is dangerous business. But it can also be a mark of supernatural courage and energetic love. She talks a lot about how it's the love of God that continues to drive this energy of incarnation. God wants to make his idea known. God's very being is oriented toward pouring himself out, investing himself in this creative incarnation. Okay, so idea, energy, and now power. Think of this as a book project. So thinking about the idea of the book, you actually write the book. That's the energy. And now the book's going to be read. Oh, dear God, help all writers. Right? This is like, no, I don't. I'll just keep this to myself. Because, you don't know if what you have invested in the work will be received by others as worthwhile, as good, as beautiful, whatever the case may be. But you put it out there. And this is the book as read and experienced, and its effect upon the readers and the author alike. And if created in congruence with a powerful idea, the energy and incarnation of any creative work, if also invested with skill and excellence, has inherent power. That's what Sayers is saying. But that power will grow when others are able to encounter the work and then respond to that work. And she speaks of the Spirit's work really beautifully in this sense as this social kind of power of bringing together the mind of the author with the mind of the audience in unity through the energy. So, thinking theologically here is incredible. The power is already in the author's mind as a part of the idea, but only through the energy of incarnation can the power be made manifest to anyone else. And so, again, we see the threefold pattern: idea, energy, power, Father, Son, and Spirit, distinct expressions of the same creative essence. That was heavy stuff. So let me just pause. How is this hitting you? Do you have any questions so far? Anything that might need to be clarified with? I've just presented to you half of the book in like 5 minutes, so I feel a bit exhausted. But is this making sense so far? Yeah, go ahead.
I just have a comment. When you were talking about book as read, it just reminded me of book clubs, how people will read one singular book and then they'll get together and discuss it, and it sort of becomes alive.
Totally.
And then it's like this sharing of ideas, and it just like creates this world.
Yep.
If that's what
Yeah.
you're saying.
That's exactly it. Yeah, and the energy of that incarnation of that book lands powerfully in different ways in different people's lives, depending on what they're going through, depending on their own story, right? Yeah, which is why there's this multiplication of power when it lands on multiple minds. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, please.
Another comment is spoken to mind prayer. The concept, the energy of prayer.
Yes, exactly. Prayer is a beautiful analogy of something that's on your heart that wants to be expressed. It's articulated. And even like a prayer of thanksgiving, I love how C.S. Lewis talks about how the like it needs to be expressed in order for the enjoyment to reach its pinnacle, to have its greatest power, in other words. Yeah, so there's this dynamic. In any kind of communication, you've got the same kind of pattern. Prayer is a beautiful example. Yeah, please.
This reminds me of the three-legged stool.
Okay, yeah, say more.
Leg away and
Three-legged stool.
it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and she'll talk about that. Second half of the book, she gets into scaling trinities. So I look forward to talking about that. Keep that in mind. Did you have a comment as well? Yeah, yeah. And it's good to recognize that when Sayers talks about power, she's talking about the power both of the one expressing the idea through the energy and then the power of that being received by others, right? So there's kind of a twofold dynamic of the artist's own experience and emotion and investment in the work and then what that generates in others. Yeah, it's beautiful how she talks about it. Keep thinking about any questions you might have. I'll just show you a couple examples, flesh this out a little bit in my own experience. So this will relate directly to Sayers because in the fall of 2021, I had an idea. Actually, the pastor at the church where I was theologian in residence at the time had an idea. He loved C.S. Lewis. And he learned that every Advent season, Lewis would read through Dorothy Sayers' Man Born to be King, the series of radio plays that lead up to the birth of Jesus. And so his idea was, what if we staged at least a portion of the Man Born to be King at our church? And why don't you do it? Okay. So it sounded crazy to me at first because this is a radio play. It's not entirely adapted as a stage play, although she did write many things in kind of with that idea. So at first I thought, I don't know if I can pull this off, but I got thinking about it and I said to him, okay, if I can hire a director and we can hold auditions and reserve the right to turn people down, because his idea was that it would be staged by people from the church, which is a tricky thing. And he said, all right, let's do it. Let's try it out. So I found a director, a friend of mine, Bruce Long, who was also the executive director of Christians in Theater Arts at the time. So that was a nice little connection. And we put our heads together and we fleshed out that idea and what portions of Man Born to be King we would produce. Okay, so that's all the idea stage, right? Someone suggests something, you take it, you build on it. It's kind of like what you were saying, Dale, about you get this initial idea, but there's a little more sketching to be done, what that idea might entail and things like that, right? And then comes the energy or activity. So we published a cast list and auditioned around 30 members of the church, which was really an amazing experience. And chose our cast, did an initial read-through. Here's some photos of us doing this. This is at a church, First Presbyterian Church in Tulsa, beautiful space. And because Bruce was in Charlotte, we had to do this in very intense blocks of time. And it was so, the energy, the activity, the incarnation of this thing was very intense. Like hammering through rehearsals, blocking movement, refining lines, making character notes, organizing costumes, finding props, like all the things you have to do. To figure out how to take this idea, which we had Sayers' words as well, right, which is a huge gift, and how to put this on, how to flesh it out in real time with real people. And then, I'll go back. Then came the big night, and the sanctuary filled with people, and the lights dimmed, and we hoped and prayed that this big idea that we had worked hard on, poured a lot of energy into to incarnate in real time, would actually work, that it would translate into some kind of powerful experience, which is that third aspect there. And, the actual performance of the play was not perfect, as you can imagine. There were inevitable glitches that happen when you're working with amateur actors, but it was a magical evening, really. And I think part of that for a lot of people in the audience, as it were fellow church members, some community members. I think there was something about seeing fellow church members embody characters that you're kind of familiar with, but hadn't really put flesh on before. And that carried power. Because to be quite honest, as a theater guy, my experience of drama in the church is not a great one. That there's been lots of unpowerful experiences in my story of drama in the church. But, I think due in part to Sayers' brilliant idea in this play, she got so much flack for, kind of bringing these conversations that we read about in the Bible into modern English, which is not a thing you did in 1940s England. So due in part to that, and then in part to the great idea of this team at the church, and then the skill of incarnating that idea by a professional director, and then the whole process of preparing and performing the play, it did really have powerful impact on everyone that was there and on the cast and on me. And it's actually hard to say, I think, if this performance would have been more powerful had the play been performed by professionals. I actually think, especially since a lot of the audience members were fellow church members, that there was a fittingness to the cast also being church members. And so you think about the relational context and the situational context. If you were around, was it April that I was here last for the other Kairos Forum? Talked about the beauty of a well-placed artwork, the fittingness of that expression relationally and culturally and situationally. That has a lot to do with how powerful something is. And I think that was at play here to make it a powerful experience. So, and just to illustrate that relationship between power, context, and fittingness, which I think is an important point, just another brief kind of daily example of cooking a new meal, especially if you have a family. So this just happened the other day in the Vander Lugt house. We're letting our kids flip through all of our cookbooks and choose one meal a week that they want to try. And so our middle, Beata, she came to us with this idea for a smoked salmon vermicelli noodle salad. Are you sure? I don't know. I mean, yeah, let's go for it. It's a great idea. So then one evening, we, mostly my wife, because she is the brilliant cook in the family, she made the meal. We gathered as much vegetables for this as we could from our winter garden. We sourced really good salmon. We poured a lot of energy into making this meal and making it beautiful and as delicious as we could. And then we set the meal in front of our kids, 12, 10, and 8, and we test its power, right? And my son's first comment, without even tasting it, sat down before him and he's like, "I prefer hot pasta." Like, okay. Why don't you just try it, right? And so he tried the vermicelli noodles, and he kind of gave a shrug, and it's like, yeah, it's okay. And then our middle, who had chosen the recipe, is like, yeah, it's not my favorite, And so you're kind of wrestling with, I get it. In order for something to have true power, you need to keep context in mind. That these are very mature tastes in this dish. And so maybe, our kids wouldn't think this is the best thing, but we gave it a shot. And, that mediocre power of the new dish was a lot about the context and the fittingness of doing that dish for these people at this time. Because I guarantee that if you served, it was amazing to me. I loved it. And if you served smoked salmon vermicelli noodle salad at any restaurant for lunch, you get 5-star reviews, right? So context is queen in a lot of things when it comes to power. All right. So we've got the main concepts. We're starting to think about ideas fleshed out in the energy that can have power, not just for the artist, but for others. Hopefully you're starting to think about your own creative process, your own works. And I think I was maybe going to take a break here, but I think I'm going to move right into the scaling section, just because I want to make sure we have enough room for some good practical discussion at our tables and together as a group. So let's move on to this section, scaling creativity. That's not a word we use every day, of course. It means a triangle of unequal sides. So it's beautifully relevant to this topic. She has a long chapter called Scaling Trinities, in which she explores how our threefold creativity can be skewed or off balance. One side of the creative triangle more or less prominent than the others. Given the fact, God is the only perfect maker. No one else is a perfect maker or artist. So we should never expect, actually, that we would have perfect balance between the idea and the energy and the power. I do have this up here. Okay, so she says that all writers, being human, however good, tend to have their trinities permanently a little out of true, slightly scaling. And so some of this, in all humility, is just recognizing where some of our natural weaknesses are, and that's okay. It's good to own that, right? And it also gives us opportunity to strengthen our own creative process as well, when we can realize if there are sides that tend to dominate in our creative process or tend to atrophy. So in what follows here, I'm going to roll through various scaling trinities fairly quickly, because I just want you to get a sense for the various ways in which each side can dominate or atrophy, particularly as pertains to writing, because that's what Sayers talks about. And then we'll get practical with these things. And keep in mind as well, as she's writing about this, she's going back and forth between theology and artistry. She's saying in the creative process, this is where it can dominate or atrophy, and that maps onto this heresy and that heresy and this heresy over there. So it's fascinating. And I'll just mention some of those things along the way if you want to jot down any notes and kind of explore it later. But we don't need to get into the details of that. Okay, so here we go. Thinking about the idea as being scaling, it could either dominate or atrophy, right? So here you see the dominance of the idea. And in a writing project, for example, this means that there might be an oppressively strong tone to the writing or theme that kind of runs roughshod over the particularities of the story. Even if the work even manages to be written. A really dominant idea is you can't even get it out of your head. You can't even take the risk of incarnating it, because that's a risk, that the idea is out there in the world. And she says that these idea-ridden writers are trying to get their message across without the full mediation of the activity, that real work of incarnation and expression, and therefore it's not going to have its full power. So they're not trusting the medium to do its work. It's all just about the idea. Now, just to point out as well, these scaling trinities I'm showing are not truly scaling because two of those other sides are equal, but it was too hard for me to draw this on PowerPoint in the amount of time I had, so just kind of go with me on this. That's the dominance of the idea. The atrophy of the idea, by contrast, might produce a rambling disunity of tone and theme that leaves the work without any kind of compelling through line, as if the author is just making it up as she goes. The craft may be really good and excellent, People may really like it, but no one really knows what it means. That's the atrophy of the idea. And really quickly, if you have an inkling toward theology, you'll like this. I'll just breeze over it. She says, just like in theology, where the Father can be too dominant and deny the full incarnation of the Son, like in Docetism, or where the uniqueness of the Father is diminished, it atrophies, and because the Father has been drawn too deeply into the creative activity, like in this heresy patripassianism, where the Father suffers alongside the Son. She says, for both the artist and the theologian, when the idea is properly balanced with the other sides, it doesn't dominate or get lost in the energy and the power, but propels them both forward and provides this integrated wholeness and direction for the work. It's beautiful. That's the idea. Now let's talk about the energy. If the energy is too big, if the energy is too dominant, the creative work may just be super impressive in terms of craftsmanship, but lack a compelling idea. And it can become, Sayers says, a mechanical contrivance that's just all technique, but no vision. I can think of some writers who just have absolutely beautiful prose, but the plot is just a mess. You don't have any idea what's going on. That's kind of what she's talking about there. Whereas on the other hand, if you have the atrophy of the energy, an artist may have really good ideas, but is struggling to bring them into expression with their materials, with their medium. So she uses the idea of a play that's really good on the page, but not on the stage. Because you can have a good idea, but you haven't considered the actual medium of live actors and a set and props and the time things take and all of that, a real audience and things like that. So good idea for a play, but the energy is going to atrophy. All right, and then she goes theological again. She says, you can see this happening in theology if you get where the Son side is too prominent, like this ancient but ever new heresy of Marcionism, where you've got the New Testament God revealed in Jesus is the new and better God of love, whereas the God in the Old Testament is this defunct God of wrath, right? Or when the Son side is too weak and does not embrace the full reality of incarnation, like Gnosticism, which diminishes the goodness of matter and the body and life on earth. It's really just all about the spiritual. So again, true balance arises, both artistry and theology, when, in Sayers' words, there's this perpetual community between the threefold dimensions, not letting the incarnate activity, whether it's human or divine, be disproportionately related to the idea and the power. All right, you with me still? We're going to do one more, the power. You're going to see the same pattern, so hopefully this is catching on. So she says that when the power is too dominant, the artist relies on emotion to carry the work without appropriate attention to its material expression or its concept. So a power-dominant work can easily become sentimentalized or sensationalized, indulging in emotions for their own sake in a way that doesn't require thoughtfulness or craft, like a shoddy romance novel, right? This is going to just impact someone, but doesn't really have a good idea, and it's not well written. On the other hand, can have an atrophy of the power, which stems from lack of inspiration, wisdom, passion, which produces just a lifeless piece of work that's soon forgotten. Sayers uses this idea of unghosted work. Speaking of the Holy Ghost, calls it unghosted, where an artist is not only uninspired, but also, she says, uncritical. She's got this great little quote, creative criticism is the Spirit's continual response to its own creation. So just as the Spirit of God is the animating force in the divine drama, so power of a creative work, it brings it alive, and it sets it apart from dead or deadening attempts at artistic creation and communication. And then she goes into the theological register. It says, see, same thing happens here. You get spirit-dominant approaches, like a sort of Pentecostal sensationalism, where special experiences and gifts of the Spirit are the thing that really matters. Or, on the other hand, a kind of atrophied, rigid cessationalism, which doesn't recognize all of the ways that the Spirit continues to work today and the power of Christian experience as guided by the Spirit. And I love the way her mind works, I have to say. I'm just super compelled by how she talks about artistry in these ways and how she talks about theology in these ways too. So we're going to go into some more examples of that and then get practical for our encouragement. But before we get there, just questions for clarification on the scaling nature of things, or what do you resonate with, or what might confuse you as well. Let's do that.
Hold on.
Wrong way.
I like the concept completely, except it doesn't seem to have a way to get to the next side of the triangle. And I would like to see that the points snipped off so they're curved.
Yeah.
And you have a road to get you there. This way, it sends you off on a tangent.
Yeah, it's a good point. She emphasizes over and over again this is just an analogy, and that the actual creative process is much more, each of these sort of indwell each other, and it's very dynamic and fluid, and same with God's life. I mean, the energy is always present in the activity, and so in reality, can you really distinguish them? Sometimes not. But for the sake of analysis and just thinking through these things, she separates them out in a way that might seem a little rigid. Yep, good point.
Would it be more accurate to say that she's looking at the processes of, because it's a even in Christianity, even our walk with Christ, it's a deeply spiritual process that we go through as humans, because it is coming from the human side.
Yeah.
To look at the spiritual. And when I'm looking at all of this, I feel like it's like if you're an artist, writer, in whatever arts you are in and whatever vocation you're in, it's a constant process of refining and reevaluating and refining and reevaluating until you arrive to that peaceful place where you're in. Does that
Absolutely
seem like what she's trying? Because I haven't read the book yet.
It is. It's a lot about the process and how, there's always a returning to the idea or a revising of the activity and the energy to experience different levels of power with the work, So, yeah, it's not like you have the idea and then you move on to the energy and then you kind of hope for the best with the power. That it is about a process that kind of folds back in on itself. Yeah. I think something similar happens in our spiritual lives as well. Yeah, it's very generative. Yeah. Was that profound?
No, I was just thinking about I was thinking about this triangle and in terms of singing, and it made me think about how easy it is when you're quote performing, that when you're singing in a Christian context or spiritual context, this triangle is so important because you can so easily live in the power, the result, doing it for people's reaction and things like that. And then it just occurred to me as well that so each time one sings, one must have this process, even if it's a short spin of, but also I'm thinking of this and thinking, okay, I grow in my maturity, and so if I'm a creator, in my humanness, I'm thinking, okay, well, I learned that, great, and I'm moving forward, I'm growing, but you have to do this every single time.
Yeah.
You sort of start over every single time, and it takes such intentionality that's critical.
Yeah, absolutely. Amen.
it makes me think, as you kind of talked through that, of the just an even greater appreciation for improvisational artists.
Absolutely.
When you think about a musician, a jazz musician,
Oh my
or
goodness.
whatnot, when they are spinning off improvisational phrases and
Incredible.
solos, etc., that this is all going on, but because of their maturity as an artist, because of their experience, because of their discipline through however much time, the way this stuff can just come out and it all still retains all of this
Yeah.
is just extraordinary.
Yeah, and what's amazing about the improvisational artist is that a big part of the idea is the very nature of how their craft works, right? So for a musician, understanding the circle of fifths and how all of the different progressions work together, or, you know, for the improvisational actor, it's like really understanding the tradition and all of the resources at your fingertips, right?
Yeah.
So it's a different way of incarnating the idea, for sure. I love that. Well, maybe if I could, I'm going to give a couple visual examples because I know Sayers leans really heavily on the literary, and that's helpful for some of you, but it might be helpful to see just a few visual examples, and then I want to end our time with some practical encouragement and get you thinking as groups and as individuals. So, I'm going to present 3 examples. One that I think is an idea-centric example, then energy-centric, and then power-centric. And they're all, we'll just go through these. So first is not Pollock, but Kazimir Malevich. So this is Black Square, oil on canvas, painted in 1915 by this Russian artist. And this is a strong idea. And actually, his work gave birth to the suprematist movement, which is seeking to liberate painting from any attempt to imitate or represent nature. It's focusing instead only on form and the sublime. Malevich was influenced by Eastern Orthodox iconography and Russian folk art and all kinds of things, but it has this avant-garde impulse to his work that's seeking to represent the spiritual impulse of those traditions, but not in figures and not in landscapes, but just in pure form. So you get Black Square that has a dominant idea, and I would say a rudimentary energy, and often a power that is limited to those who understand the idea. That's the issue. That if you understand the art historical tradition, if you resonate in some way with the idea of what he's trying to do, then you might actually agree with him that this is ground zero for modern art. That's what he claimed. Otherwise, it's just a black square. Okay, so that's what happens in an idea-centric incarnation, is that some people will get it, some people won't. It can start arguments. It can be very divisive, right? So it's still, in a sense, a good work because it's doing something very important. But the emphasis is on the idea. We might also consider an energy-centric work. This is Jackson Pollock's Autumn Rhythm, painted in 1950. I remember standing before this massive work for the first time. It's 17 feet long, I think, 8 feet at the Met. And if you sit with it, you just start to notice this delicate mesh of all of these rhythmic swirls and blots, and you've got white and brown, you've got a little even turquoise in there on top of that coil of black that connects everything together. And this came from Pollock's action painting, which sort of developed by accident, and then he developed it on purpose with the intent of reacting against disembodied modern art. This. Okay? Idea-centric art. He wanted energetic art, embodied art, where the artist had to be involved, painting, crouching, jumping, moving, dumping, This is a very athletic thing to create a painting like this. And that energy of the incarnation, he wanted it to be just out there on the canvas so people could see his process and see his energy. which can be just an immediately powerful. It was for me when I saw this. It just drew me from across the room. Like, wow, like, man, this is incredible in a lot of ways. There's an idea involved here, but the energy is just right there for you to experience. But it can be hard. I mean, if you don't know the idea, all you have is sort of that energy, and it seems kind of chaotic, right? What holds this together? So I think it's an energy-centric kind of work. And then you have power-centric kind of works. I'll use Rouault as an example. Jesus Despised, created just after World War I, 1922, part of his famous Miserere series. It depicts the suffering of Jesus alongside the suffering of other marginalized figures in war-torn Europe. And he's creating this work out of enormous personal and social grief. That's where this is coming from. And he's pouring that out in the creation of his work through these signature black lines reminiscent of stained glass leading, blacks and grays, and just pouring that out in his work. And I think of these three artists, I think Rouault is the closest of having a good balance of idea and energy and power, and I think that's due in large part because of his deep Christian faith. But it's often that deep emotion and experience that drives his work, and that then hits viewers in these scenes, not just of a suffering Christ, but of these other marginalized figures. And so much like the Impressionists, when we encounter Rouault's work, we encounter not just an idea and not just techniques, but an experience of the world. That's what we get in Rouault's work. By the way, that Rouault book, that was based on a symposium we did on Rouault's work, and I just think there's so much to learn from this artist, and was really happy with some of those contributions. But one of the cool things we did at that symposium is, because I don't like doing only scholarly things, like, okay, artists, let's, how might you respond to Rouault's work today? So I had visual artists and poets and others responding to how his work continues to resonate. So in the book are also statements from those artists and the work that they created in response to Rouault's work, which is cool. Okay, so I hope that helps clarify what Sayers was doing and how the idea and energy and power relate. Now, just to wrap things up, I want you to think about your own creative work. Could be some form of artistry, could be in your vocation, could be both. And I want you to think about where you are scaling. I want to think about how God might be calling you today to strengthen your creativity. And to be honest about that and what that might require. Or to be encouraged in where your creativity is strong. You might be like, I have 1,000 ideas. I'm ready to go. And that's awesome. That's where you're strong, but maybe you need some help in the expression of those. How do you get those out into your medium? So as we think about that today, as forming our threefold creativity, I want you to think along the lines of thoughtfulness, excellence, and honesty. Thoughtfulness of the idea, excellence of the energy or the activity, and honesty in the power. So thoughtfulness, first, just about bringing reflection and intentionality to bear on your work. And you're exploring, what ideas are currently motivating or permeating my work? Or what ideas do I want to be motivating or permeating my work? What new ideas? Or putting it differently, what aspects of God's truth and goodness and beauty do I want to bring into the world? Because I know, as probably not even as much as many of you, that it's so easy just to jump from project to project, from commission to commission, from task to task, without time to just step back a little bit and reflect and have some intentionality. And so very practically, I want to ask you, do you have a Sabbath-shaped rhythm for praying and dreaming and thinking about the ideas that you are uniquely poised to incarnate? When I was a pastor, I started practicing a Q day, which was, and I commended it to my whole team, which is an idea I stole from John Stott. Very proudly stole from him. The invitation is to choose one day a month, ideally, could be one day a quarter. That's in addition to your regular Sabbath day. A Q day, you block it on the calendar, and it is a day to reflect and dream and ideate. It's a day for thoughtfulness. It's a day to allow your ideas to align with God's ideas. It's an amazing idea in itself. It was one of those Q days where I realized I've been thinking a lot about beauty. Although I was really busy in the pastorate, but I realized during one of those Q days that God was leading me to write something about beauty, to try to encourage the church. And it took 7 years to do that. But I guarantee you, if I didn't have that Q day, I would never have started. It was on that Q day I was like, okay, God, you're right. I think I need to do this. And I want to do it. And so finally finished Beauty as Oxygen. It came out in June. And I'm so grateful for that space to be reflective, to recognize what the idea is, and then make a plan to flesh it out. So all of us are invited to imagine ideas and to submit those ideas with prayer and open hands before God the Father who conceived the universe into being. Isn't that an amazing thing? And we ask God to test the ideas. We don't need to do all of them, right? Maybe some of them are selfish, but we need space to reflect on that. Second aspect would be excellence. God did not just involve a part of himself in the incarnation. This is the mystery. God poured out all of himself in the incarnation of the Son. God's full energy and excellence is on display, albeit veiled in human flesh. But so what I want you to think about is based on the ideas and gifts that God has given each one of us. We're invited to join God's creative mission, right? By devoting ourselves to our vocation and to our craft. And so one of the questions is this one: what might I be holding back in that process? What, if anything, is holding you back from pouring your full self into your creative activity? That could be parenting, it could be leading a team, it could be writing a poem. We're tempted to hold a part of ourselves back. So what might that be for you? Something that often comes up for me is just this started when I was a pastor, as I'm preaching and teaching, I have this temptation to not be vulnerable enough. And so to connect to the congregation or to my audience. So a big challenge for me is to say, it's okay, we're all in the same boat, we're all broken. I might as well share that part of myself. But that's something that it's difficult for me to pour that part of myself out. Okay, and then what opportunities might you embrace to hone the craft of your creative activity? When my son was 4 or 5 years old, I can't remember exactly, he got this little necklace with a miniature harmonica on it. And he thought it was really cool, and every once in a while, he'd blow the harmonica just for fun. And one day, like years later, he's like, Dad, I really want to learn the harmonica. Like, I don't want to just blow air through this thing. I want to learn the technique of harmonica. I want to learn how this thing works. I'm like, man, I'm ready, buddy. Let's go, So that kind of thing, what might be your opportunity in this moment and season for how you can hone your craft a little bit more of something you already love? Just a word of caution here about excellence, though, which is that pursuing excellence in and of itself can easily become an idol. You need to be aware of that. And it's easy to pursue excellence for the wrong reasons. It could be driven by pride, jealousy, some other self-centered attitudes. So I always try to ask myself, how is my pursuit of excellence oriented toward the glory of God and the good of my neighbor? Do you desire excellence to make a name for yourself or a name for God? And how is the excellence of your craft an offering of artistic bread and wine and water for beauty-starved neighbors? That's a good thing to ask. And just speaking as a pastor here for a moment, this is where the gospel is incredibly freeing. when it comes to the energy and the excellence of your creative calling, because there is nothing that you can create, and there is nothing you won't create that will make God love you more or less. And there's no other religion that has that statement of good news. Now, the gospel motivates our creativity, but our creativity never earns God's love, nor does it discard it. It's amazing. And that frees us. We are free to create excellent things because in the economy of grace, we're free to fail. Which leads us to honesty in the power of the work. It's a good bridge there, I think, because in Christ, we're also free to be honest about the reality of the world, the reality of who we are. We're given the best model of honesty in the Bible, right? The Psalms, which are a third of the Psalms are gut-wrenching laments about the struggle, about the broken world, about the struggle of sin. And the rest of the Psalms are honest about the power and goodness of God, and we can be honest on both of those things. And there is a tendency, though, I think, for Christians in our creative work to be less than honest sometimes about the fullness of life and all of our human experiences. There is a temptation to gloss over some of the most difficult things, which is that danger of sentimentality I mentioned before, which is not only dishonest, but in Sayers' words, there's no power there. That lacks power. True creativity is about telling all the truth, but telling it slant, as Emily Dickinson said. And so where in your creative work are you most tempted to round off the edges of reality? It's a good thing to consider. We can talk about any of these things if we have time. Maybe we'll just have to take a bunch of them with us, for reflecting later. I'm almost done. How can the power of how you experience the world be a gift to others through your creative work? So like in Beauty is Oxygen, for example, I try to be really honest about both the wonders and the horrors of the world and how beauty emerges in the midst of all of that. That it's not just in nice situations where beauty is. It's in very dark ones sometimes. And that my hope in that is to try to encourage people to see beauty where they might least expect it and to be surprised how beauty is actually stronger than ugliness in the world. And I find it's really important to have people in your life to help you be honest like that. When I'm working on a project, it's the honest feedback from others. They're like, come on, Wes, I know there's more. You're not giving it your all. You're not being truly honest here. Or just people to say, that's not good. Go do that again. So just this other question as well. Who do you have in your life, or who could you ask, who could help or keep your creative work be honest and powerful? And I think that leaning into honesty is really connected to learning to trust the Spirit working in our own experience, the Spirit working through others and their encouragement and criticism, and that the Spirit is never threatened by our honesty. That's also freeing to me. And is there no matter what, and there are certainly no surprises with God. So I think it would be fitting just to close with a prayer. I love the collection of liturgies coming out of the Rabbit Room, Every Moment Holy. If you're familiar with, there's 3 volumes of liturgies for every moment of life, from changing diapers to dying. And there's one prayer here written by Ned Bustard, a friend of mine, and Doug McKelvey, who's the main writer of those liturgies. I'm going to use this as a prayer, and then I'll let you decide if we have time to stay and talk some, or we just take these questions with us, whatever you think is best. Let's pray with these words. O Christ, through whom all things were made that have been made, meet us in our lesser making. Channel our creativity. Guide our hands and hearts. Give us discipline to steward well our craft. Let us find a fertile place to sink our roots within the long tradition and continuing conversation of your children, who across thousands of years have sought to display beauty, to articulate truth, to celebrate holy mystery, and to somehow echo eternal yearnings in the things we create. Let us, in the short span of our lives, contribute something more to that good conversation. And let us release our expectations of the times and places and ways in which it might be received. Let us instead simply craft the finest offerings we are able within our given limits of time and skill and circumstance, and then offer them to you so that you might use it as you will. Let that be enough for us, O Lord, in your mercy. Amen.